trying to find a gospel to like perfectly match up with the theme isn't always easy. So I found like a verse that perfectly went with it. So that's why our gospel reading was that long. It has been incredibly fun for me and hopefully for you to do the sermon series that we've been engaged in. We've been looking at some of the most colorful stories of the Bible because we want to learn together how to read the scriptures in a way that's meaningful, in a way that gives us life, and in a way that doesn't make us say really hurtful and destructive things about all kinds of people. Are you with me on that? Yeah. So we've been having fun with it. At least I have, because I've been giggling a whole lot up here. And anytime I can stand up and giggle in front of people, it's a good sign for me, for some reason. And today we have a really long story. The part that was read up here was only like a sliver. And because I always want to be introducing you to the latest of technology in the iPhone, iPad world, I thought we could hand out the story on this brand new technology called paper. Perhaps you've heard of it. So I'm just going to ask like a couple people if they could pass it to... Yeah, thanks. All right. So if they're going to pass you the whole story, and that way we'll all be able to read together, and it'll be great, great fun. This particular story, well, anytime I'm reading a Bible story, in the moment, it's like my favorite story, but this one, there's something really, really special about this story. And even though I'm a pastor's kid, and so I spent like the first 18 years of my life going to church 2 to 3 times a week, it wasn't until 2015 that I finally heard someone preach or teach about this particular story. So for like more than half my life, I haven't heard, even though I've been going to church 2 or 3 times a week, I'd never heard someone talk about the story until 2015 at a conference I was at called Keep Going, and it was led by pastors like Rob Bell and theologians like Peter Rollins, and there was a former contemporary Christian singer-songwriter Vicki Beeching, who we'll talk about at the end of the service and her story. But it was just this incredible time that I had in Laguna Beach, and Rob Bell, the pastor, he actually walked us through this passage, this story, and perhaps it was because of the personal things that were going on in my life. Some really touchy personal things. This story just broke its way into my heart. And it's been working on me for like the last 3 years. So I'm so excited to share with you some of the things I learned then and some of the things that I keep learning, because every time I turn to the story, it does something new to me. So are we good with this journey? Are we okay with this? All right, let's quickly pray. Gracious God, we thank you for bringing us here again. We thank you for these stories that hopefully just inspire us, that challenge us, that confront us, and that comfort us. Lord, I pray that the words of my lips be pleasing to you and that they offer grace and peace to my brothers and sisters and siblings. In your precious name we pray. Amen. So, before Peter goes into his trance, which we read about earlier, which I'm sure you've all had that kind of same experience where you've just totally gone into a trance, right? Common experience? Oh, okay. Well, anyway, before that trance, something else happened before. There's a little bit of a backstory that we need to get to. And do we all have the story now? Okay, cool. Thank you guys so much for passing that out. Greatly appreciate that. There's a bit of a backstory that we need to get to, so let's just go ahead and read together. Acts chapter 10. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion, in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 in the afternoon, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. Couple quick things to note about these first 4 verses, this part of the backstory. Cornelius is a centurion. He is a Roman soldier in the land of Israel. Cornelius is an oppressor. He's someone who works with the Roman Empire that has the imperial boot on the neck of the Jewish people. And yet, somehow this story is also going to be about his freedom and his liberation, because evidently this God believes that oppressors also need liberation. Right? When Nelson Mandela was freed from prison in the 80s, he told his oppressors, "I can't fight you anymore. It's you I'm fighting for." Love and God is interested in the oppressed being free and the oppressors. Are we getting started yet? And this centurion, perhaps he's on the verge of liberation because he's recognized, he's called it God-fear, which was this Jewish term for talking about non-Jews who had some kind of an affinity, some kind of devotion to the God of Israel. Cornelius had evidently already come to realize that the Roman pantheon of gods just wasn't doing it. It wasn't good enough. It wasn't freeing and liberative. So he had already begun developing practices to worshiping the God of Israel. He's called a God-fear. And in fact, he's already taken on some pretty traditional regular prayers because he's praying at a pretty traditional regular time of the day at 3 o'clock. Cornelius has developed regular, disciplined times of prayer. This story, which is ultimately a story about the nature of growth for several different people, kind of tells us that it's regular disciplines, structured prayers, the traditions. When we engage in these things, in structured prayer and disciplines, we allow ourselves the time to be opened up to new experiences and new growth and new life. It's the structure that breeds spontaneity and newness. It's the people who meditate every single day. It's the people who have these specific disciplines that are sometimes the most open and progressive people that I've ever met. Right? Yeah. So let's keep going. Cornelius stared at him in fear. Good thing to know. Fear. If I were praying and all of a sudden a booming voice started talking to me, I might also express a little bit of fear. Fear, anytime we have a new circumstance, is normal and natural. Fear is a gift, an evolutionary gift that kept our ancestors safe from lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Right? The question in regards to growth and its relationship to fear is this. Does fear get to drive? Does fear drive the car? Does fear get the steering wheel? One of my favorite authors, Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, she says that fear gets a place in her life. It gets the back seat in the car, and it doesn't get to choose the music. Because fear never chooses the best music, evidently. But fear absolutely has a place in the car. Fear has a place in our life. Are we letting it steer our life? And the story continues. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Peter." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. As I was reading this past week, I thought, wow, what would it be like if all of us were growing in such a way that when we had a new experience, people around us believed us? What if you and I were so trustworthy that when we had new experiences, everyone simply believed that we must be telling the truth because that's what we do? Cornelius is a lot of things, but Cornelius could be trusted by his friends and his colleagues. What if we were trusted by our friends and colleagues and coworkers, bosses, people who work for us? What if that's a growing edge for some of us? And the story continues. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. As again, like we said, we've all done that before, right? gone up to the roof to pray in a trance? Yeah. Peter too. So important to know. Peter too has developed this like regular time of prayer. Peter is engaged in regular, disciplined practices of prayer and meditation. And it's those regular practices of prayer and meditation that open Peter up to this profoundly new experience in his life. Are we developing regular disciplines in our life that open us up to new experiences and growth? And then Peter falls into this trance. Interesting thing to note about the word trance here. In Greek, it's actually ecstasis, which is where we get the word ecstasy. Come on, Peter does ecstasy? That's too good. It's in the Bible. The word ecstasis, in the Greek, it means having that altered state of consciousness. It means having that out-of-body experience. And as we'll note later, it also has this connotation of a severe disruption. Peter falls into this out-of-body experience, this altered state consciousness, and it's also a disruption. Because the voice tells him to do something that runs very contrary to everything that he had been taught. The voice continues, and it says, he saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet, a holy sheet, if you will. Very proud of that one. I'll be here all week. This holy sheet descends. It's like a tablecloth being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Surely not, Lord. I shop at Whole Foods. I'm a vegetarian." I prefer not to kill these animals. And Burbank, come on, Burbank. We now have our own Whole Foods. How many of us have been there? Oh, come on. It's a Whole Foods. Peter says, "No, I gotta go to Whole Foods." Peter says, well, at least if I was Peter, I would say, "God, I don't really want to kill these animals. Can I kill some tofu?" That took me a while to find. There's really no good pictures of someone stabbing tofu. As a vegetarian, I'm kind of with Peter. Surely not, Lord. But that's because I'm a vegetarian. Peter says, "Surely not, Lord," because Peter is a devout and faithful Jew. And Peter understands the Torah. And Peter understands the rules and laws in the book of Leviticus. And in Leviticus 11 and in many other places in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, God speaks through Moses and says, people who have just been brought out of slavery, here are the animals that you can eat. Here are some four-footed animals you can eat, and then here's a whole laundry list of animals you cannot eat. And here's some reptiles you can eat, and then here's a whole long list of reptiles you cannot eat. And here's some birds that you can eat, and then here's a whole long list of birds you can't eat. Now, when people read the book of Leviticus, when people read rules that exist in Leviticus 11, sometimes people in the 21st century say, "See, this is the problem with religion. There's so many rules, and these rules are weird. Like, why? Just religion, too many rules." So why are there these rules? Why are there these rules in Leviticus? Why are these rules here? A couple of things. First of all, if you go back a couple thousand years ago, several thousand years ago, to the time in which it is said that God liberated the Israelites out of slavery, out of bondage, out of Egypt, sanitation codes were different than they are today. So on a very basic level, if you look at the list of animals that people in these times were allowed to eat, the Israelites were allowed to eat, God was simply providing them like a basic sense of sanitation and cleanliness. Freedom, being able to live, is freeing, right? So there are these rules in part simply because God was trying to keep these people alive. And then, second, we could say that there are these rules because, as we've seen with Cornelius and as we've seen with Peter, there's a certain grace and a gift to having structure in your life. That having rules and structure and guidelines can actually be a gift to all of us. I've seen this countless times in my life. If you go to an AA meeting and you meet people who have lived very unstructured, chaotic lives, the structure of AA and all the rules of AA is actually a gift. It's a grace. When I was working with juvenile offenders, when I was a teacher, having structure and strict structure for my students that had been living chaotic lives wasn't me being mean. It was me being kind and loving because structure and disciplines are helpful. So on the first two levels, it's just, there are all these rules because God was trying to keep some people alive, not eat some dirty, filthy animals. And then God was also just trying to provide people with some structure, some help, some relief. And then last thing I would say is, for why there are all these rules, if you'd been living a long, long time in slavery, and your whole identity is wrapped up in you being a slave, and making brick after brick after brick, when God liberated the people out of Egypt and brought them from a place, the Hebrew word is Mitzrayim, out of a narrow place into a wide open space, there were all kinds of people around them. And God gave this group of people that seemingly had no identity, God gave them Torah as a way of giving them an identity. Here is who you are. Here is how you act. And here's what you eat. And here's what you don't eat. Because you are special. You're not going to be like everyone else. You are special. And here's the special way that you're going to live. Do we see that religion and all these rules they're a gift. They're a grace. They're a grace. And so Peter is very much aware of all these different reasons for having these rules. And so Peter responds to God saying, I want you to now eat the impure animals. Peter says, no. Peter actually uses religion as a way of arguing with God. Peter uses the good to argue against the path that God is calling Peter towards. Sometimes the good, sometimes religion has gotten in the way of you and I and other people in our world from being able to follow the path of growing and healing. Have you ever seen someone use religion as a way or means to not grow? Have you ever seen people use religion to refuse to grow? Am I the only one that's ever seen this? How many times have you seen people use religion to not grow, to not be open-minded, to not continue their path of growth? Peter uses the good to not grow, to respond by saying no. I think about defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are this incredible gift from God that we develop when we're kids as kind of like protecting our fragile beings. Defense mechanisms keep us from getting hurt. And yet what we see all the time is people who are unable to ever let go of their defense mechanisms aren't allowed to continue growing and having healthy, normal relationships in their adulthood. Sometimes the things in life that were helpful and good for us at some point in our life become the very thing that hold us back from the next thing that God is calling us towards in our personal story of growth. Sometimes we have to let go of the good so that we can continue to grow. And so God says to Peter 3 times, this happened 3 times, because if you're like Peter, sometimes it takes you at least 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times to get the message when God's trying to teach you a lesson, right? How many of us have had to learn a lesson over and over and over, and you're like, I'm so tired of learning this lesson. And God's like, well then, learn it. Peter takes 3 times. This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheep was taken back to heaven. Verse 17, while Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, because we all would be wondering about the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Peter was there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them. Peter went down and said to the men, I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come? The men replied, we have come from Cornelius, the centurion. He's a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say. Then Peter invited the ultimate impure, the Gentiles, the Romans, the oppressors, into his house to be his guests. Because Peter was learning. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The following day, he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up. Stand up, he said. I'm only a man myself. That's how I hear him saying, at least. While talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. This is such a human moment. This is amazing. He said to them, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or clean. Peter is the master of the backhanded compliment. So passive-aggressive. He's still learning. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection. Nope. Oh, I love it. He's so human. May I ask why you sent for me? Cornelius answered, 3 days ago I was in the house praying at this hour. At 3 in the afternoon, suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayer and remembered your gifts to the poor. Send to Joppa for Simon, who is called Peter. He is the guest in the home of Simon the tanner, who lives by the sea. So I sent for you immediately, and it was good for you to come. Now we are all here in the presence of God to listen to everything the Lord has commanded you to tell us. Then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. Peter now has been with the Roman. Peter's now been with the impure, the unclean, the other. Peter now eats. Peter now has tasted and touched and seen. And as you know in your life, when you have tasted something, when you have seen something, when you have touched something, you can't untouch, unsee, and untaste. Once the disruption has happened, it's happened. And if you try and go back, you're just bitter. So Peter has tasted and touched and seen, and he can't untaste and untouch and unsee, so he continues moving forward in his personal journey of growth. Some people have said that change and growth, that new stages of growth, always bring with them greater levels of freedom, greater levels of inclusion, greater levels of complexity. For Peter, he wasn't free to eat some food, but now he's free to eat some food. The people of Israel weren't free, but then they were brought out to open spaces. For Peter, there was a greater sense of inclusion. The table expanded, and more people were allowed at the table. The tribe of Israel expanded, and it became bigger and bigger as it was led out of slavery into Sinai, into the wilderness, and greater complexity. Because Peter realizes that this world of dividing us and them isn't quite right. Somehow them is actually part of us. The us is a little bit more complicated and complex than originally thought. And that the categories that I've been using to dividing people is just no longer working for me. The world is a little bit more complicated. New stages of growth always lead to greater levels of freedom, greater levels of inclusion, and greater levels of complexity. Another thing that we would want to say is that these moments of change and growth, if we're honest, they usually happen because of some kind of disruption. Because life was going a certain way, and then there was the diagnosis. And then your son came out of the closet. And then your daughter said, I'm doing this with my life. And then the job fell through. And in those moments, we all have this opportunity. We can move forward with disruption. We can allow God to speak new things into our lives. Or we can retreat, but retreating is going back to the narrow places. And God is calling each and every single one of us uniquely into our own journeys of growth, towards greater freedom, towards greater inclusion, towards greater complexity. And the last thing I would want to say is Peter's journey was Peter's journey. Peter's journey wasn't every single buddy else's journey. There were all kinds of amazing, faithful, mystical Jewish people at the same time of Peter who didn't have that same experience, but nevertheless found all kinds of ways to greater freedom, to greater inclusion, and greater complexity. Peter's journey was Peter's. Your journey is yours. And what you taste and touch and see that allows you to greater expansion isn't necessarily going to be the thing that leads your neighbor to experience greater freedom and inclusivity and complexity. We are all called to expand. We are all called to grow. May you, my brothers and sisters and siblings, may you hear God calling you out of places like Egypt or Mitzrayim or narrow places. May you hear God calling you from a way of dividing the world into pure and impure and good and bad. May you find those moments of disruption to be moments of growth. And when they're painful, may you remember that these disruptions, God calls them ecstasy. May your growth be ecstatic. Amen.